Hi everybody. Second Nanotyrannus paper has come out and we are going to talk about it. Now, for anybody who is not up to date on the ins and outs of this debate, I want to go into a little bit of context very briefly just to orient you as to where we are and where this paper fits into the broader body of science that is addressing the Nanotyrannus question. The Nanotyrannus question fundamentally comes down to the identity of small-bodied tyrannosaur fossils that we find in the latest Cretaceous rocks of Western North America. For many years, most scientists had thought that these fossils belonged to juveniles of Tyrannosaurus rex, so in effect T-Rex teenagers that died before they reached adulthood. A minority of scientists and a lot of commercial collectors had an opposite view, and they saw these small tyrannosaur fossils as not being T-Rex juveniles, but adults of a much smaller species of tyrannosaur that they called Nanotyrannus. Now, for the past several decades, most of the scientific evidence we had seemed to point towards the juvenile T-Rex hypothesis being correct, and that hypothesis became the consensus view among paleontologists. And so it informed a lot of the research that we've done on tyrannosaurs since Nanotyrannus fossils were first discovered. These quote-unquote Nanotyrannus fossils became what we based our understanding of the early life of T-Rex on. They were what we used to understand how tyrannosaurs grew, and they even affected how we studied the evolutionary interrelationships of tyrannosaurs. The traits that we saw differing between Nanotyrannus fossils and Tyrannosaurus rex adult fossils were things that paleontologists assumed were ontogenetically variable. In other words, that they would change as animals grew and weren't reliable distinguishing characteristics that we could use to identify different species or to figure out when we'd found a new species of tyrannosaur. And so, of course, with that being such a foundational assumption in how we understand tyrannosaurs, it would be a big problem if the scientific consensus were wrong. Well, about a month ago, my postdoctoral advisor, Dr. Lindsay Zano, and I published a research paper in the journal Nature showing that that was exactly the case. The scientific consensus was wrong.
Nanotyrannus is real.
And we did that by providing the first scientific documentation of a fossil called the dueling dinosaurs fossil. This is a 100% complete individual of Nanotyrannus. It was preserved next to a nearly complete Triceratops, which is why it got the dueling dinosaurs nickname, and it preserved parts of the Nanotyrannus skeleton that we never had access to before. For instance, it showed us that Nanotyrannus had a significantly shorter tail than T-Rex with fewer vertebrae. You can't add vertebrae as you grow from teenage to adult. Nanotyrannus also has much longer arms and hands than an adult Tyrannosaurus rex. In fact, some of the bones in its hand are almost twice as long as the same bone in even the largest T-Rex fossils we've found. But maybe most important, the growth record preserved in the microstructure of the dueling dinosaurs Nanotyrannus's limb bones showed us that it was stopping its growth when it died. The animal hadn't fully stopped growing yet, but it was reaching what we call somatic maturity when it died. And so this was an adult animal, and for all intents and purposes, it did not have any more growing left to do. It's possible that its bones were going to get like a few millimeters thicker with more growth, but nothing more than that. The animal was at its adult size when it died. And maybe more than anything else that we showed in our paper, this is what convinced a lot of scientists that they had had the wrong opinion of Nanotyrannus fossils. Because prior to the dueling dinosaurs, no Nanotyrannus fossil had ever been proven to be skeletally mature when it died. The famous Nanotyrannus specimen Jane, which is housed at the Burpee Museum of Natural History in Rockford, Illinois, was confirmed to be a rapidly growing subadult when she died. Now, our study of the data from Jane does suggest that Jane was not going to get anywhere near T-Rex size when she was an adult, but she was going to grow into a significantly larger animal had she lived to full maturity. But most importantly, the type specimen of Nanotyrannus, what we call the Cleveland skull, CMNH 7541, housed at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History in Ohio, did seem to be a juvenile when it died as well. Now, interestingly, even people who supported the idea of Nanotyrannus existing generally acknowledged that the Cleveland skull belonged to an immature dinosaur. And so in their view, it was from an immature animal. This animal was not at its adult size yet. It was not done growing, but they thought that it was a Nanotyrannus that had died before it reached full maturity, not a juvenile T-Rex. Obviously, the side of the debate that thought that this was a juvenile T-Rex saw what looked to be obviously the skull of a young, rapidly growing animal and said, well, of course that's a juvenile skull because that must be a juvenile of T-Rex. And so this is one area where both sides of the debate actually tended to agree with each other. And so the study that just came out today shows us something really surprising, and that's that the Cleveland skull belonged to an adult Nanotyrannus as well. That makes it the second confirmed Nanotyrannus adult, and shows that almost everybody who had looked at the Cleveland skull over the past 20 or 30 years has gotten it wrong. Almost everybody thought that it clearly came from a juvenile tyrannosaur, and it didn't. That tyrannosaur was an adult when it died too. Now, you might say, how is it possible that every paleontologist got this wrong while this team of researchers was able to get it right? And the answer is that this team of researchers developed a new way of studying dinosaur growth using a kind of evidence that we had never been able to use before. And so to explain this briefly, I want to talk a little bit about a technique we use to study dinosaur growth called osteohistology. Histology just refers to taking thin sections of anatomical structures and looking at them under a microscope. You can do it with tissue samples, you can do it with whole organs harvested from study animals, and you can do it with bones. And when you do it with bones, we call it osteohistology. Osteohistology has become a really important method in paleontology because it allows us to directly study the record of growth that's preserved in each individual's bones. And so you don't need to guess how old an animal is or how rapidly it was growing. You can look at the bones and they can tell you that. And that's really important because in dinosaurs and other reptiles, we don't have obvious external indicators of maturity like we do in mammals. If you look at the limb bone of an immature mammal, an immature person or horse or dog or cat or whatever you want, you'll see what looks like a groove at each end of the bone, a groove or a gap of some sort. This is the remnant of a structure called a growth plate, which is the center of new bone formation during growth. And so an immature mammal will show an obvious growth plate gap on their bones, and a mature mammal won't, because the growth plate winds up fusing into the rest of the bone when growth stops. Growth worked differently in dinosaurs and still works differently in other reptiles. They don't have growth plates, and so we can't look at their bones and know from an obvious external signal whether or not the animal was done growing. The only way to know that confidently is to cut the bone open, take a very thin section of it, look at it under a microscope, and see if there's a structure at the edge of the bone called an external fundamental system, which is a series of stacked growth lines that occurs at the edge of the bone because growth has stopped. Right? This is effectively that we're putting down these lines of arrested growth that are deposited every year in really, really close proximity to each other. And so we're just making this really, really dense stack of lines of arrested growth because we're functionally not adding any new length or width to the bone. This is considered the gold standard for figuring out if a dinosaur is an adult or not, but there's a problem here. You'll notice I was talking about limb bones, and traditionally, these are the main bones that we look at to determine whether or not an animal is done growing. Sometimes we use ribs for this, but there's a lot of reasons that ribs are not the best bones to use for this purpose. The gold standard is the femur, the thigh bone. This is what we wound up sectioning and basing most of our conclusions on for the dueling dinosaurs specimen because we had one preserved. But the Nanotyrannus holotype specimen is just an isolated skull. And because it's just an isolated skull, we didn't have any limb bones that we could section histologically to figure out with confidence how old it is. You'll notice that the kinds of bones I talked about preserving this sort of growth record, limb bones and ribs, are very, very long bones. And that's in fact what they're called anatomically. They're called long bones. And traditionally we've assumed that we need long bones in the postcranial skeleton, so that's everything behind the head, in order to study a growth record. But what the authors of this paper showed is that there's actually a bone that is preserved in the head region that can preserve this sort of growth record as well. And that's a bone called the hyoid. The hyoid is a really interesting bone because in terrestrial vertebrates, it is a bone that does not articulate with any other bones in the skeleton. It kind of floats in the throat, and it supports the tissues of the larynx, so the kind of opening of your windpipe below it, and the muscles of the tongue above it. It's a really, really interesting element. It's not always preserved in dinosaurs. And in dinosaurs, because of the way it develops and actually which part of the original hyoid gill arch of fish that it derives from, it manifests as this really, really long, thin rod. And so the authors of the study said, well, that's a long bone. It might preserve a growth record. And there's one of these preserved on the Cleveland skull, which means that we might be able to directly get an age, or at least an indication of maturity, for the Nanotyrannus holotype, and we can figure out if it actually comes from a juvenile or if it comes from an adult. And so to figure out if this method could work, the researchers involved in this study took histological sections of hyoid bones in modern birds and modern crocodilians, and a range of other extinct theropod dinosaurs like Coelophysis and Allosaurus. And what they were looking for was consistency between the growth record preserved in the hyoid bone and the growth record preserved in the rest of the skeleton. And by and large, they found it. When the researchers looked at hyoid histological sections from immature animals, they found that the hyoid did not show signs of maturity. And when they looked at the hyoid histology of mature animals, they found what seemed to be signs of maturity that are very similar to what are seen in postcranial long bones. They found what seems to be an external fundamental system or something like it around the edge of the bone, and they found other indicators of maturity that are seen in histological section, like evidence of bone remodeling, which is something that tends to happen as an animal gets older. And so based on this, they concluded that their idea was feasible. They could take a hyoid histological section of the Cleveland skull's hyoid, and they could use that to determine whether or not it came from a mature animal. And when they did that, they found very clear evidence that the Cleveland skull did come from a mature dinosaur. This animal was not a juvenile when it died, it was an adult. Now, of course, this alone wouldn't necessarily mean that it has to be a different species from T-Rex, and the researchers acknowledge this in the paper. They say that, listen, we know that this animal was an adult when it died, and it's an adult that's like half the linear dimensions of T-Rex and an order of magnitude lower in body mass, so 10 times lighter than T-Rex. But there are other potential explanations that we could use to explain this. It's possible, for instance, that it's a T-Rex that had some sort of congenital dwarfism and never got close to its adult size. But there's no indication of anything like a process involved in generating dwarfism on the skeleton. The authors also consider the possibility that this is an example of dramatic sexual size dimorphism, which just means that males and females of a particular species differ in their body mass. Almost all vertebrate species show some level of sexual size dimorphism. It can be relatively minor, like it is in a lot of species, or it can be relatively dramatic. But if this were the case in T-Rex, it would be the most dramatic example of sexual size dimorphism that has ever been recorded in a vertebrate. And it would also be interesting because it would mean that the males would have to be the very, very small sex, not the females. And that's because a large T-Rex specimen known as B-Rex seems to preserve evidence of medullary bone, which is a kind of bone tissue that is only deposited by female reptiles when they are in the breeding season. And so the presence of medullary bone would mean that has to be a female, and then by default, these small adults, if they're T-Rex adults, would have to be very, very small adult males. Now, in some species where males fight very vigorously for the right to breed, there are also what are called sneaker males, which are males of small body size that kind of stay under the radar and are able to evade these intra-specific contests so that they're able to breed without fighting. But again, this is something that's pretty rare and not really a feasible explanation for why the Cleveland skull is so small if it is a T-Rex specimen. By far, the simplest explanation for the Cleveland skull belonging to an adult dinosaur that was 1/10 the size of T-Rex is that it was not a T-Rex. And so the authors of this paper conclude, just as Lindsay and I did about a month ago, that Nanotyrannus must be a valid species, and therefore the scientific consensus that Nanotyrannus was the juvenile form of T-Rex is definitively not correct. Now, this is something I could talk about for a long time because there are tremendous implications for the fact that paleontologists had misidentified these fossils as T-Rex juveniles for so many years. But I want to talk about something else right now just to close out the video. And that's that this study shows something very important that we were unable to demonstrate in our own study on Nanotyrannus that focused on the dueling dinosaurs. The dueling dinosaur specimen is absolutely incredible. It is 100% complete. It is exceptionally preserved. It presented us more information about Nanotyrannus than we had ever had before. But it's not the specimen that bears the name Nanotyrannus lancensis. That specimen is the Cleveland skull. The way that nomenclature works in biology, really, is that names, scientific names, are attached to particular specimens that serve as the reference specimen for that species. And that's what we call a type specimen. So in the case of Nanotyrannus, Nanotyrannus is definitionally the species that the Cleveland skull belongs to. Any other specimen that you call Nanotyrannus is what we refer to as a referred specimen. It's something that we can compare to that reference specimen and say, we think this looks very much like the reference specimen, we think it belongs to the same species, but it is not definitionally a member of that species. And that means that there was one potential edge case scenario that would complicate the work that we did on the dueling dinosaurs, which would be that yes, we proved that the dueling dinosaurs specimen isn't a juvenile T-Rex, but by some miracle, it turns out that the Cleveland skull was a juvenile T-Rex. If that were the case, we couldn't keep calling the dueling dinosaurs specimen Nanotyrannus lancensis. We would have to come up with a new name because the name Nanotyrannus would be attached to the Cleveland skull, and in that circumstance, the Cleveland skull would be identified as a juvenile T-Rex. It's weird the way that this works. I think a lot of people don't realize that names are attached to specimens specifically, and so that the status of those specimens will affect whether or not a name is considered valid or the correct name to use in a certain circumstance. It's a little esoteric. Now, during our work on the dueling dinosaurs specimen, we looked at the Cleveland skull quite a lot too. And we found a number of ways that the dueling dinosaur specimen and the Cleveland skull looked like each other and only like each other among all other known tyrannosaur fossils. And so we had absolutely no reason to think that the Cleveland skull would not turn out to be a member of the same species that the dueling dinosaur specimen was. But there is that 0.0000001% chance that we had missed something important that would show that the Cleveland skull was a juvenile T-Rex and that the dueling dinosaurs was actually a member of some different species that had not yet been named. This study is really, really important for our work too, because it shows that there is no possibility that the Cleveland skull will turn out to be a juvenile T-Rex. There is no reason to think it's a juvenile T-Rex, and that's because it shares no unique anatomical features with T-Rex, because the anatomical changes that would need to happen for it to grow into a T-Rex are developmentally impossible, and because, as the new study has shown, it wasn't a juvenile at all. The only possible refuge that a Nanotyrannus denier could have had at this point is to say, well, everybody agrees that the Cleveland skull belongs to a juvenile, and so that's probably a juvenile T-Rex, even if all of the other specimens turn out to be something else. But now these scientists have shown with a really interesting study developing an entire new way of studying dinosaur growth with a bone that nobody realized could preserve a useful growth record, this fossil belongs to an adult dinosaur. And so the entire Nanotyrannus debate was, to some degree, resting upon a false conclusion about the ontogenetic stage of this dinosaur fossil. The whole juvenile T-Rex hypothesis is predicated on the idea that Nanotyrannus fossils belong to juvenile dinosaurs. And, at least in this case, they don't. In fact, now there's only one Nanotyrannus fossil that we would even say does belong to a juvenile, and that's Jane. And that's all I have to say about this study right now. I think it's a really important study that was done by an excellent team of researchers, many of whom I am proud to count among my friends in the field of paleontology. And so if you've enjoyed this video, I encourage you to go take a look at their paper and read it for yourself. And if you're a middle schooler or high schooler who is enjoying learning about the way that paleontology is really done, I want to encourage you to look into the Sternberg science camps that are run by the Sternberg Museum of Natural History at Fort Hays State University in Kansas. These summer camp experiences offer a tremendous diversity of different windows into what paleontologists actually do in their careers. There are camps run all across the United States that offer different skill development, from fossil preparation to fossil excavation to anatomical research to cutting-edge techniques like CT scanning of fossils. If you're somebody who thinks that you want to be a paleontologist one day, I think one of the best things that you can do is try to attend one of these Sternberg science camps and learn more about what being a paleontologist really means. I was never able to attend one of these science camps because I was a little bit too old. They started existing when I was in college, so I wasn't able to participate in them anymore. But I really wish that I'd been able to for two reasons. One of them is that I wish I had had the opportunity to, early in my education, start learning some of the real skills that paleontologists use in their day-to-day lives or in their research careers. I would have really liked to learn more about how to excavate fossils, or learn a little bit of fossil preparation, or learn early on how to CT scan a fossil and what to do with CT scan data after we collect it, and how it can be used for research. These are all really important things for paleontologists, and they are things you learn at the Sternberg camps. The other reason I wish I could have been a Sternberg camper is that the Sternberg camps have fostered a really a tight-knit global community of paleontologists as alumni from the camps have moved through their education. Many of them are now entering graduate school on their own or getting to the end stages of graduate school, and that's a tremendous value in itself. If you become a Sternberg Camp participant and eventually a Sternberg Camp alum, you will be a part of this global community of young paleontologists with some instant contacts that you'll be making all throughout the world of paleontology now. And I just think that's something really special. Now, at the time I'm recording this in December of 2025, the Sternberg camps have not yet started accepting applications for the 2026 summer camp season. Usually that process starts in about the middle of January. I encourage you to follow their social media pages, which are linked in the description, so that you don't miss any updates about when they start accepting applications, and you can get right on your way to entering paleontology as a trained professional. And finally, I want to take a moment to thank the amazing fans and patrons of the Skeleton Crew who make this channel possible. Today, I want to highlight Benjamin Siepser, insert nickname, the Legion __BB, Christopher Bellis Jones, Adam Molos, Kevin Preem, Aaron Anderson, Keenan Taylor, Noah Riccio, Dino Dom, Apache 28, Squat Pump, King Zashu, Touch Connors, Changi Raptor, Resty HBK, Chaotic Kaiju, R. Wesley Nipper, Camphibia, Blacklight Virus, Life Finds a Way, Black Spectral Pig, The Wigster, Brett Booth, Juve, Lincoln Rivenbark, Matthew Miller, Zaku Meister, Freddie Harper, Nunyas, Raylan, and Nacho Raptor, along with all of the other patrons of the Skeleton Crew whose names are scrolling in the credits right now. Thanks a bunch, everybody. Congratulations again to the authors of this paper. This is an exceptional piece of research, and I'm really, really happy to see it published and to finally see the final nail being driven into the coffin of the juvenile T-Rex hypothesis. Long live Nanotyrannus, everybody. We'll see you next time.